Sometimes I think that the love of peace is something I was born with. Even as a child, I didn't look for noisy games or eternal running, preferring to sit by the window with a box of colored pencils, watching how the light falls on the trees, how the clouds move, changing the mood of the sky. This need for silence and my own space has stayed with me forever, and perhaps that's why buying a house has become more than just a deal for me. It has become the starting point of a new, mature life. And before we continue, write in the comments from which city you are watching this video. Enjoy watching. Savannah Pines charmed me at first sight. Streets lined with magnolias, houses in the colonial revival style, quiet, almost lazy evenings, when the whole city seemed to freeze, absorbing the aromas of salt and pine trees. After the hustle and bustle of the roll, this place seemed like paradise, almost unreal, too soft to be real. But it was mine. Mine by right, according to the documents, according to the dreams that have lived for years in sketches, in folders, in my heart. The house I chose stood at the very end of the street with the poetic name Blue Heron Way. Two-storied, with a white facade and a dark roof, it seemed to me like a living being, ready to take me into its arms. There were 4 bedrooms inside. One became my bedroom, the other became my studio, and I left 2 more for guests, although I hardly hoped that anyone would use them. The spacious living room with high ceilings and soft light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows served as a place for me to relax, reflect, and make spontaneous creative leaps. There was also a backyard surrounded by greenery, with wild hydrangeas along the fence and tall slender pines that whispered to each other at night when I was sitting on the veranda with a cup of tea. "Are you sure you can handle this alone?" Mom asked me when we were standing on the porch for the first time, and I was tearing the keys with the welcome home tag out of the box. "I'm more than sure," I smiled, inhaling the air that smelled of heated wood and the sea. "I've been coming to this for a long time." My parents, John and Martha, looked quite happy at the time. They had just sold their old house, the one where my sister and I spent our childhood, and were going to retire to live a little more peacefully, renting a small apartment in Raleigh. They were sure that they had enough savings, that they could afford to travel, take classes at the gardening club, and take long walks along the embankment. And even though I felt a little anxious, I didn't argue. Especially because they transferred all the proceeds from the sale to Melissa. Melissa has always been the eldest, not just in age, but also in character. Confident, noisy, with a loud laugh and a clear idea of how life should be arranged. She convinced her parents that her idea to open an online handmade gift store would change their fate. They say it will be an investment, not just a help. I remember pursing my lips when I heard about it. I had my doubts, of course. Melissa was not very stable, and her projects rarely lived to see real implementation. But I didn't say anything. The parents made a choice. And I was completely immersed in arranging my new home. It had only been 6 months when everything started to fall apart. Melissa's business didn't fire up. The platform she was counting on turned out to be unprofitable, suppliers failed, and customers were fickle. 3 months later, it was all over. My parents were left without a home and without savings. I didn't find out about it right away. We continued to meet once a week, usually on Sundays, and I noticed that lately they looked tired, as if something was sapping them from the inside. "You have a lot of space, Kristen," Mom said one day, pouring herself tea at our usual round table. "We were just thinking. Do you want to move in with me?" I asked, not raising my voice, but feeling something tighten a little in my chest. "We're not asking for forever. Simply, renting is killing us. And you have so much space, so much comfort." I looked at them. They weren't young, but they still carried themselves with dignity. My father was silent, but I could tell by the way he clasped his hands that it was difficult for him to say it. It wasn't easy for both of them to ask for help. And yet they asked. I could have said no. They would have to look for something else, maybe move to a shelter for the elderly or ask someone from a relative. But I couldn't. They were my parents. The ones who paid for my art school when we didn't even have the money to repair the roof. Those who tolerated my whims and scattered paints all over the house. I owed them. And in the end, it really wasn't hard for me to let them in. Sure, stay, I said. You can use the large guest bedroom. I'll help with the rest. At that moment, it seemed to me that it would be temporary. That we would find a way to coexist, that the house would remain what it was, a refuge, calm and reliable. I didn't know then that everything was just beginning. I came back from Denver on wings. My heart was fluttering with delight, joy was ringing in my head, and my body felt pleasantly tired after a busy week full of meetings, new faces, and recognition. My first solo exhibition was a great success, several paintings sold, promising offers from gallery owners, and an invitation to participate in a prestigious catalog of American artists. All this seemed to me to be a step in the direction where I had been striving for so long, to a solid place in the art world, when my name no longer needed to be explained. The plane landed late in the evening, the road to Savannah Pines flew by unnoticed. I hummed something under my breath without words, looking at the familiar turns of the highway, beyond which my house, my fortress, my quiet corner was already waiting. I dreamed of a cup of hot tea, soft pajamas, and the darkness of my bedroom, where I could curl up and let go of all the tension of these days. But when I opened the door, something in the air seemed wrong to me. Smell, alien. Sweet, with an admixture of chips and cheap air freshener. I walked a few steps forward and froze. Suitcases lined the wall, carelessly folded bags, a pair of children's sneakers. Melissa, Charlie, and Lucas were sitting on my couch. My parents stood shyly at the entrance to the kitchen, as if they didn't know what to do with themselves. What is it? I gasped in disbelief. Why here? Their stuff? Chris. Mom began, folding her hands as if she were praying. Please don't get mad. They are. Temporarily, my father put in, scratching his head. They have difficulties. We moved out of the apartment. There was nowhere to go. Are you serious? I felt like my insides were shrinking. And you didn't even think to call me? Melissa sat up from the couch, looking at me with the expression of someone who is embarrassed, but not so much that she remained silent. I told my mom to ask you, but she thought you didn't mind. I just flew in from out of state. I even have my suitcase still in my hand. I didn't scream, but my voice rang like a string. Have you decided for me? It's just for a couple of months until we find work and a place to live, Mom added pleadingly. Lucas is so tired. Poor thing. I looked at my nephew. He was playing on the carpet with trucks, spilling them right on top of my shawl, which was lying on the ottoman. Soft cheeks, disheveled hair, concentrated gaze. He was completely defenseless. And despite my anger and shock, I couldn't help but feel sorry. He is not to blame for the situation. 2 months, I managed. No more. Oh, you're an angel, Chris. Melissa rushed to me with a hug, which I almost dodged. I knew you'd understand. Thank you. You'll be in the second guest room, I said dryly. I'll arrange the bedclothes for you tomorrow morning. I walked past them and stopped in the kitchen. My hands gripped the refrigerator door, and I froze. It was almost empty. A few cans of soda, ketchup, an open carton of milk, slices of cheese, that's it. No soups, no cooked dishes, no fruits, no bread. The groceries I left behind before I left are gone. Just like the order. The table was covered with crumbs and sticky syrup, the sink was full of dishes, open packages and empty pizza boxes were scattered on the countertop. The following days showed that the temporary was becoming permanent. At first, I tried not to notice. I got up earlier than everyone else, went to classes, and worked in the studio as best I could. But more and more often, when I returned home, I saw the same picture, Melissa and Charlie on my couch, buried in their phones or remotes. The TV was screaming, toys were scattered, and in the kitchen, someone always didn't wash the plates or forgot to buy food. Sometimes I saw my canvases gathering dust because I just didn't have the energy to paint in the midst of this chaos. "Are you looking for a job?" I asked Melissa one day when I went into the kitchen and saw her watching dessert recipe videos on YouTube. Of course. She didn't even look at me. We keep our finger on the pulse. I just don't want to settle for any nonsense. Charlie was actually a sales manager. Well, at least something, for the first time. A part-time job in a supermarket or cafe? Chris, we're not loafers, it's just that things are difficult right now. We need some stability. I handed her the paper. Here's the electricity bill. It's twice as big as usual. Can you help me? Melissa glanced at it briefly and shrugged her shoulders. Well, children use a lot of water. And the light, of course. Lucas is afraid of the dark. We can't stop him from doing that. The answer was so matter-of-fact, as if it wasn't about my money. I left in silence. It was useless to talk. It's been 3 weeks. The room started to feel cramped to me. There is less space. My comfort is gone altogether. I started waking up at night from the noise of the TV. My personal space has disappeared into the daily mess. Even the garden that used to be my solace was now littered with plastic buckets and cars. Sometimes I caught myself thinking, it's like I'm not the hostess, but the tenant. The house has become something alien. Melissa acted like she'd always been here, Charlie treated me like a backdrop, and my parents were increasingly justifying their behavior. And I was starting to lose my patience, drop by drop. I caught a cold on the plane. The cabin's air conditioner was working as if we were flying over the Arctic, not from Denver to the Carolinas. The next morning, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest and a scratching throat, as if an old rusty nail had settled inside. Teaching had to be canceled, studio work had to be postponed. I was lying at home, wrapped in a blanket and drinking lemon and honey, hoping that the disease would go away as suddenly as it appeared. By noon on the 4th day, tired of idleness and silence, I decided to walk to the store. When I returned, the house was suspiciously noisy. There were sounds of shuffling and thuds coming through the walls. I put the bags in the kitchen, went up the stairs, and suddenly realized that all this was coming from my studio. My heart sank. The studio was sacred. She was not just a room, she was an extension of me, my inner being, my breath and thoughts, my hand, brush stroke, gaze. I rushed to the door. When I entered, it was like being doused with cold water. Melissa and Charlie were standing in the very center of the room. Several of my canvases were stacked against the wall, some tilted on top of each other at an unnatural angle. The easel, which had recently held the work I'd been working on for 3 weeks, was dragged to the window as if it were old furniture from a garage sale. What are you doing? My voice cracked, it was both hoarse from illness and broken from terror. Melissa, without stopping moving, turned around and, as if I had stopped her from hanging the kitchen curtains, said, "We're just reorganizing a bit. The lighting is gray here, and our room is very cramped. Lucas has gotten older, he needs more space." This is my studio. I stepped forward, feeling irritation burn my throat, but the anger was stronger. It's not a storage room. This is the place where I work. Where I make a living. It's not just a room. You can't just. Why can't you paint in the garage? Charlie interrupted, dropping a stack of canvases on the floor. One of them hit the table leg with a thud. There's plenty of room. What kind of drama is this? Because it's damp in the garage, I said each word slowly, as if I were explaining it to a child. And because it's my property. I don't have to explain. You promised that it would be temporary. You were supposed to leave 2 weeks ago. Melissa crossed her arms over her chest and pressed her lips into a thin line. You've become so selfish, Chris. We are your family. We're just asking for a little more space. It's not a crime. Then find a place to live. As you promised, I looked her straight in the eye. I did not sign up for you to turn my house into a dormitory. Plans are changing, she replied with annoyance. We can't leave Lucas in this tiny room. You have no idea how difficult it is to find a decent job right now. You know how unstable everything is. We need a little more time. That's all. I stepped forward and picked up the canvas that Charlie had dropped. It was scratched, and there was a dent in the corner. It was my last job. Already ordered. I looked at the brushstrokes. There was a part of me embedded in them, something that couldn't be returned. My heart skipped a beat. You will put everything back in its place immediately, I said, no longer with anger, but with icy calm. And you start looking for a place to live. Starting today. It's not up for discussion. They were silent. Melissa was looking at me, and there was something unfamiliar in her gaze, cold, stubborn. I saw in her face not the sister with whom I used to draw chalk on asphalt as a child, but an outsider who settled in my house uninvited. A few days later, I started this conversation again, hoping that time had cooled my emotions. We were sitting on the veranda, the evening light caressed the branches of the pines, cicadas sang somewhere in the distance. It seemed like the right moment. Melissa, you said you would stay for 2 months. The deadline is up. I need you to start packing. We're looking, she replied, without even turning around. But there is nothing suitable. We need a 3-bedroom place with a good school and affordable rent. And there are no such options now. Everything is incredibly expensive. Then maybe it's worth considering something simpler. For the first time. The main thing is to start. I talked to a lawyer, Charlie said suddenly, coming up to us. His voice was strangely pleased. We are registered at this address. You can't just kick us out. This is already considered a permanent place of residence. I couldn't find the words right away. My head was spinning. I felt my arms go numb, as if I'd been electrocuted. What did you just say? I whispered. The law is on our side, he continued. Especially with a child. If you try to kick us out, we'll sue. I turned to my parents, who had just come out onto the veranda with mugs of tea. Their faces were serious. You don't agree with that, do you? I asked them. Mom put the cup on the railing and nodded slowly. Kristen, you have to understand. This is your sister. It's hard for her. Lucas is small. We can't just put them outside. I can't believe it. I whispered. This is my house. My life. And do you support them? You're overreacting to everything, my father interjected. Everything will be resolved. Just a little bit of time. Everything snapped inside. I looked at them and felt the flame of trust go out in me, as everything that seemed unshakable began to crumble. They tried to convince me that I was wrong in my own home. That I have no right to borders. That family is an argument that overrides common sense, labor, the law, and agreements. That night, I lay in the dark for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Sadness washed over me in waves, alternating between anger, fear, and bitter disappointment. It was my home, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. The flu crept up unnoticed, like a shadow under the evening light. At first, a slight sore throat, then muscle pain, fever, chills, and complete exhaustion. I lay in bed for almost a week, forgetting how silence sounds without coughing and shaky breathing. On such days, everything is perceived in a strange distorted light. The world narrows down to a glass of water, a blanket, and barely audible footsteps behind the wall. But even in this painful fog, one thought slowly but clearly dawned on me. Melissa and Charlie are not just not looking for work. They don't even pretend like they're going to. Every morning began with the roar of the TV. The sounds of cartoons for Lucas, mixed with fast food ads, conversations, laughter. All this seemed to remind me that I was not in my own house, but in some kind of communal shelter where everyone lives by their own rules. When I staggered up to the kitchen for tea, I was greeted by a sink full of dirty dishes and a refrigerator filled with half-empty packages that I had once bought. Sometimes I'd hear Melissa discussing what she could order for lunch with her mom, and never once did she ask if I needed help, or even just come into my room. By the evening of the fourth day, lying in the dark with a fever in my 40s and a throbbing pain in my temples, I suddenly realized that everything inside me had snapped. There was no more fear of offending, insecurity, or guilt. It all burned out like coals after a storm. All that remained was a solution, as hard and dry as an autumn leaf. They didn't give me a choice. I've allowed them too much, for too long. My kindness turned into poison for me. I was waiting for Saturday, as they wait for changes, as they wait for freedom. My parents were going to take Melissa and Charlie to the mall, about an hour's drive from the city. Lucas needs to update something, Mom said, not looking at me. I nodded. My heart was beating modestly, as if it also knew that today would be the point of no return. When the gates closed behind their car, I went to the window and watched it turn the corner. The moment was almost symbolic, like a curtain closing the first part of a play. I took out my phone and dialed the number of Dan, a locksmith I knew, whom one of my students had once introduced me to. "Hi, this is Kristen. Do you remember how you once offered to help me if I needed locks urgently?" "Of course, Kristen," he replied at once. "What happened?" "I need to change all the locks. Today. The sooner the better." He arrived 40 minutes later. I met him on the doorstep in sweatpants and a hooded sweater, with disheveled hair and traces of flu in his voice. He didn't ask any unnecessary questions. He just nodded, took off his tools, and got down to business. That's why I called him. I didn't have to explain to Dan what was going on in the shower. He knew when to keep quiet. While he was working, I went upstairs and started packing. I started with Melissa and Charlie's room. Their clothes were in disarray, children's books everywhere, open bottles of lotion, socks under the bed. I wasn't trying to be careful. I just grabbed, folded, and tightened the zippers. I collected Lucas's toys differently. I knew where his stuffed moose was, and where his car with the broken mirror was, which he never parted from. I put all this in a separate box, carefully wrapped with a soft towel. Everything was easier with my parents' stuff. My mother kept things in order, my father was laconic in his everyday life. I packed my bags and put a photo on top of them that was on their bedside table, an old picture of us all laughing at a picnic. Looking at him made my heart ache. But the hand did not waver. By 3 o'clock everything was ready. Dan finished installing the last lock and, after accepting the payment, wished me luck. I thanked him and closed the door behind him. Then, with a feeling of strange clarity, I began to carry the suitcases out to the front yard. One by one, carefully, discreetly. It was as if I was not the hostess, but a courtesy courier returning things to negligent tenants. When their car came around the bend, I was standing by the window. I saw them slow down, then stop. How the faces in the salon changed, from relaxed indifference to bewilderment, and then to rage. Melissa ran out first. She rushed to the door and pulled the handle. The lock wouldn't budge. Then again, harder. I slowly opened the door on the chain. "What the hell kind of joke is this?" "Stop it!" she screamed. "Open the door." "You don't live here anymore," I said calmly. "All your things are on the lawn. You have an hour. Then I'll call the police." "You're crazy," Charlie interjected. "This is illegal." "I already regretted letting you in," I replied. "You have exactly 59 minutes. They screamed, begged, threatened, tried to pressure, accused. My parents stood aside. My mother was crying. My father was silently pressing his lips. Lucas clung to her, not understanding what was happening. I looked at him, and only then did it really get hard for me. Not because of Melissa. Not because of Charlie. Because of him. A little boy, always smiling, became a hostage in the battle of adults. It was over an hour later. The cars disappeared around the corner one by one. There was such silence that you could hear your heart beating in it. I entered the house, locked the door, leaned against it with my back and slowly slid down. The floor was cool, and the wood smelled of wax. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath for the first time in weeks. The next morning, a colleague called me to tell me that Melissa had posted a post on Facebook. There was a picture of Lucas sitting on my porch, and the suitcases in front of the house. In the comments, I was called a monster, cruel, heartless, selfish. I didn't answer. I just wrote one short comment: before you judge, ask yourself, would you let them in? That was enough. It's been about 2 weeks since I finally closed the door on my family. The days passed slowly, filled with an unaccustomed silence, as if the air in the house had cleared of tension, which I had previously felt without even realizing it. I started sleeping with the windows open again, allowed myself to cook leisurely breakfasts and leave paint brushes on the kitchen table, because now no one could accidentally dirty them or hide them somewhere in the closet in an attempt to free up space. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was living in my own house again, not hiding in it. And yet sometimes, on the quietest evenings, I was overcome by a feeling that was difficult to deal with. It wasn't a regret. No, I was sure of what I was doing. But the shadow of guilt, light, almost intangible, still lurked inside, especially when I thought of Lucas. His frightened eyes, his clenched shoulders, how he clung to the stuffed moose on my porch. I knew it wasn't his fault. He was just a kid caught between his parents' irresponsibility and my right to personal boundaries. One morning, when I was just about to go to the studio, the phone rang. It took me a moment to recognize the voice. It was tense, restrained, as if the person on the other end of the line had been considering whether to speak for a long time. "Chris? This is Holly. I hope I'm not distracting you." "Hi," I said, sitting on the edge of the chair. We weren't particularly close, and her call surprised me. "Is everything okay?" Holly paused before speaking. "I just thought you should know. Melissa and Charlie have been staying with Aunt Carol for the last 3 weeks." I held the phone closer to my ear. "At Carol's?" I asked again. But she wrote that I was insensitive and a disgrace to the family. Holly chuckled softly. "She said she'd show you what real compassion looks like. And she's sheltered them in her house." Right after that Facebook drama. I was silent, guessing where the conversation was going. "Did everything happen again?" I asked. "1-to-1. Holly's voice became firmer. "They stayed at home all day, doing nothing. No work, no help. The bills started to rise. The kitchen looked like a battlefield. When Aunt Carol tried to talk to them, Melissa replied that she would live there for free, whether you like it or not." Can you imagine? I bit my lip. Part of me wanted to be indignant, part of me wanted to laugh. But most of all, I felt easement. She kicked them out? With the participation of the police. Yesterday. They made such a scandal that the neighbors called the district police officer. They're living in a motel somewhere, not far from the grocery store. Your parents are there too. Parents? We got a job as cashiers. I saw them by chance when I stopped by for groceries. They seem to be holding up. Dad is hunched over, but his eyes are clear. My heart squeezed painfully. No matter how angry I was, no matter how they betrayed me, they were still my parents. And to see them in uniform, standing behind the cash register when they deserved to retire, it hurt. Thanks, Holly, I said after a pause. Thanks for telling me. We said goodbye, and I sat in silence for a long time, looking out the window. The world behind the glass was calm and clear. The branches of the pines swayed gently in the wind, and a squirrel ran along the path. And yet, a hurricane of emotions was raging inside me. I wasn't happy that I was right. But at least now I knew it wasn't my fault. I didn't ruin the relationship. I didn't let you down. I just refused to be a doormat. That evening, I went to the opening of a new exhibition at the City Gallery. I almost changed my mind about going, but something inside pushed me. You deserve to be where art is, where sincere people are, where your work is respected. That's where I met Tom. He was standing by one of my works, a watercolor depicting a coastal cliff on a cloudy day, and, unlike many, he was not just looking, but peering. There was an expression on his face that I knew well, focused, a little vulnerable, as if he wasn't seeing a painting, but something of his own, hidden in the brushstrokes and colors. Are you an artist? What is it? He asked as I approached. Yes. That's my job. Very honest, he said, without looking away. It's like what thoughts look like when you're silent. We started talking. He turned out to be an architect, and he came to the exhibition with his 10-year-old daughter, Lauren, who dragged him here after school. Lauren loved to paint, and her childhood delight in canvases was contagious. Tom was a widower, calm, reserved, and very attentive. We drank coffee in the gallery buffet, discussed lines and light, shapes and proportions, and then smoothly moved on to the personal, as if all this was not the first conversation, but the continuation of a long-standing acquaintance. Gradually, he began to appear in my life more often. Sometimes he called to tell me about a new book he'd read. He sent me photos of unusual facades or bridges. He invited me to small art cafes or farmers markets. One day, I took Lauren on a tour of my studio, and the girl held her breath, looking at the palettes and tubes of paint as if they were magical artifacts. It's so quiet here, she said. Even the air here draws. I smiled. It was a compliment that I will remember for the rest of my life. Tom was easy. He respected boundaries. He never imposed, did not interfere, did not play the savior. We both went through difficult periods, and that's probably why we communicated without falsehood from the very beginning. He knew about the situation with my family. I told him without embellishing, without looking for excuses. He just nodded, putting his hand on my shoulder. Family is difficult, he said. But the right to your own space is not selfishness. This is maturity. With him by my side, I felt my breathing steady again. My house has once again become a place where I can be heard, where silence is peace, not silent resentment. We didn't rush anything. But every day we spent together proved that after disappointment, hope can always come. After the storm, there is clarity. After betrayal, respect. It happened on one of the most mundane days, at the grocery store, where I went out of habit in the late afternoon, when the counters were still full, but the crowds had already subsided. I was leisurely picking out ripe peaches, enjoying the fragile piece, when someone nearby reached for an avocado. I looked up and met my mom's gaze. At that moment, time seemed to stop. We both froze, frozen in a kind of awkward silence, among the marble floors and the rustle of packages. Mom looked different. Not worse, no. Just more tired. There were shadows under her eyes, and her hair was pulled back in a bun, as it had been when she was a child, when she was in a hurry to work. She was holding a basket with milk, bread, and a bag of apples, all the essentials, nothing superfluous. Yet there was no malice or bitterness in her appearance. Just be careful. We both didn't know where to start. Hi, she said first. Her voice sounded hollow, almost alien. You look good. Hi, Mom. You too, I replied, trying to speak calmly, evenly, as if there weren't months of silence, pain, resentment, and shattered trust between us. We stood like that for another second, then she pursed her lips a little, nodded and slowly walked to the cash register. I watched her go, and a strange feeling slowly grew inside me, not regret, but something akin to sadness for no reason. A couple of hours later, already sitting on the veranda at home, wrapped in a blanket, I heard the beep of the phone. It was a message from her. Simple, short. We should have respected your boundaries. Sorry. I've read it several times. It wasn't an apology in the way that I might have once expected. It didn't touch on the essence, betrayal, pressure, tacit approval from my parents when I was left alone against the whole family. But there was still something important in those words. Confession. The first crack in the wall, which we built ourselves. I replied, "Thank you for writing. No more. No less." It took time for both of us to learn how to talk to each other again, on new terms. And we started, slowly, hesitantly, as if we were learning to walk anew. Sometimes she wrote to me about the weather, sent me pictures of the garden that she and Dad were still trying to maintain near the motel. I answered dryly, but politely. We didn't touch on the past. We didn't discuss Melissa. We didn't talk about the house. But they did. And that was enough. With Melissa, everything remained different. I wasn't mad at her anymore, I wasn't fuming, I wasn't analyzing why it had happened. I just accepted that there are things that cannot be restored. There are relationships for which time was set aside, and it has expired. In her world, I may have remained a villainous, cruel, cold. But I didn't try to convince anyone anymore. The truths didn't need any applause. While the old bonds were crumbling, something new was emerging in their place. Tom became a part of my life, not trying to replace what was there, but bringing with him something else: lightness, sincerity, and respect. He never invaded my space, appropriated it, or turned my house into a rented place of comfort. On the contrary, his every gesture said, "I'm here because you let me in, and I respect that." One evening, when we were sitting on the porch, he leaned on the railing, looking into the distance, where the sunset burned the sky with tangerine light behind the trees. "My lease ends in a month," he said casually. I turned to him. He didn't look at me, just continued to watch the last rays glide over the tops of the pines. "There's a lot of room here," I replied softly, and he finally smiled. "I don't want to impose, Chris. Only if you're really comfortable with it." I didn't answer right away. I just took his hand. He understood. We didn't need long explanations. A lot has changed since then, but nothing has disrupted the delicate balance that we carefully built. Lauren would come over for the weekend and spend hours in my studio mixing paints and painting strange animals that you wouldn't find in any zoology reference book. Tom made coffee in the morning, sometimes loudly singing songs in the shower that I barely recognized. He didn't ask for permission for every move, but he always gave me the last word. The house lived, breathed, but did not invade my essence. One morning I woke up to a familiar smell: toasted bread, a light aroma of too strong coffee, and, I think, a little cinnamon. I went into the kitchen and found Lauren standing on tiptoe at the stove. She pulled on my old apron and tried hard to deal with the toaster, which was persistently spitting out toast ahead of time. "I wanted to surprise you," she said, noticing me. "Breakfast. Like in the movies. Only, the toasts are slightly burnt." "These are the best toasts I've ever seen," I replied, and kissed the top of her head. Tom was already cleaning up after her, not making a scene out of it, but only quietly praising her efforts. I stood at the door, watching them, and suddenly realized that this was what I was missing: not just peace, but respect, sincere concern, and simple kindness. My house is mine again. But not because I'm alone. It's because there are those who know what it means to be together, not out of a sense of duty, not out of blood, not out of profit, but because they chose each other. And they chose it correctly.